Um, let's see if I can fix this. Those of you who are able to watch that, what did you get out of it? What were those, you recall those three solutions that, sort of the only three things out there that we know of that can try to prevent this problem of overuse, overexploitation?
You have the common control, cultural norms, and the creating of property rights.
Command and control. Okay.
Command and control.
Command and control. That's basically government. Okay. Government regulation. Cultural norms, which are things you can't really, I mean, you can create policy and you can create property rights, but you can't really create culture. Cultural norms are things that just have to evolve over time, but they can work. And of course, the limitation is that they are typically very localized and specific to a particular group of people. And then there are property rights. And in this case, in the case of New Zealand, the property rights are sort of abstract and very different from what we're used to with regard to land or timber or mineral rights, something like that, in production of oil and gas. So you might recall also that at the very last part of that video, the gentleman said that most of the world's, most of these world's issues often boil down to this inability to establish property rights, or inability to enforce property rights. It may be that property rights existed historically, but the law within a country is not enforceable, or those property rights are not enforceable. And let's see, I was going to mention also that even with regard to things like economic development, it's been argued by economists, particularly a fellow by the name of, his name is actually DeSoto, I believe. And anyway, he had found that a lot of the problems with development, with getting businesses started and that sort of thing in private development in developing world countries, is that property rights are few and far between, and typically also there's way too many government regulations that inhibit people from starting legitimate businesses. So you have businesses and you have some degree of property rights, but often what happens is the government's unable to enforce those property rights. So it's very, very difficult for someone to invest in a business or attempt to, let's say, even collect on their investment without losing a lot of it to bribes and or to relying on sort of quasi legal systems. So the idea with that is to go around and map land and in the developing world to establish boundaries and to establish property rights and put property on the books and formalize it. So a lot of the key to just gaining economic development is to bring about property rights, to establish some sort of property rights. Basically, and you mentioned your roommates, this is basically what I think Benjamin Franklin supposedly said, good fences make good neighbors. If you can decide clearly on whose responsibility it is to, do the dishes, or who has clear rights over territory, then and there's no ambiguity, and people tend to get along a little bit better. So establishing property rights, of course, in New Zealand was that works for New Zealand's fishery and what's referred to as the exclusive economic zone for New Zealand. New Zealand is an island country, right? Two major islands, and so there is a zone around New Zealand that New Zealand has the ability to control. But outside of that zone near New Zealand, you're on the high seas, and in the high seas there is really no ability to for one particular country to enforce the law. And oftentimes it comes down to, like, the United States will wind up trying to enforce regulations, or at least to protect our interests, the United States interests. Well, anyway, so that's a little about the tragedy of the commons, ways to prevent the tragedy of the commons. Strangely enough, the command and control side is the one we're probably most familiar with. We assume that the Environmental Protection Agency or the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management will have responsibility to carry out regulation. And we create piles and piles of regulations to try to stem problems, try to solve problems. What that often does is it creates a new industry that's associated with that regulatory structure that is put into place. So, in other words, there's a lot of money spent that never goes anywhere close to solving the problem. It's a very, very expensive solution, even if you're able to enforce it. Well, I don't want to jabber on here forever. I'd like to hear what you all think, and see if you can come up with other examples of either tragedies of the commons, or maybe ways in which we might create or better manage property rights. Can you think of any other tragedies of the commons besides the one that we've kind of focused on, which is marine fisheries?
The extraction of oil and natural gas, which when you run out of that, eventually, there's no more of that, and everyone's pulling it up out of the ground. And then once you run out of it, there's nothing left. And then what do you do after you lose your oil and natural gas?
How is that the tragedy of the commons?
So you have a bunch of people, well, mostly corporations, vying for a set resource that, extends across a very large area, right? So they're taking it up out of the ground, bunch of, you got different groups, and, the more you extract, the less you're going to have in the long run,
Well, that doesn't make for the tragedy of the commons. To have, for the tragedy of the commons to exist, you have to have two conditions. Remember what those were? What the good that you're trying to, that you're after, in this case, maybe petroleum. How is petroleum subject to the tragedy of the commons? It would have to have those two conditions together, right? And those two conditions are what?
Can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, the good has to be rival. That is, the good has to be one in which if someone uses it or if someone claims it, somebody else cannot, right? So it's property. So it's if you extract petroleum out of the earth, then somebody else is not going to be able to come along and extract the same petroleum out of the earth, right? So there's a finite amount. Would you agree with me, Tanner?
Yeah.
Okay, so we agree that petroleum is a non-renewable resource, and that it's rival. If more than more than one person wants it, then it's rival.
Mhm.
So what's the other condition you have to have for tragedy of the commons?
Non-exclusive.
It has to be non-excludable, right? So how is oil and gas non-excludable? Are tuna non-excludable?
I suppose so, yeah.
Well, except for the tuna, in the case of tuna, except for the example we saw with ITQs in the New Zealand system, where they've created property rights, and by creating property rights, you create an excludable good. You take a non-excludable good like tuna, or actually the size of the catch of tuna, and you make it into an excludable good by distributing those rights, distributing that quota among fishermen. So where could petroleum deposits, how could those be non-excludable?
But I mean, you have corporations that they have quotas that they have to meet for production value, and there is a market based around it. So even though it's not where tuna, it's renewable, every year, but the more you extract out of the ocean, the less the next person has.
That
Right?
doesn't matter.
Oh, it doesn't?
What I'm asking you is how can you make petroleum? How can petroleum ever be a non-excludable good?
I guess that's where the breakdown. I'm not being able to.
Yeah. So petroleum is probably one of the, after maybe land, is probably the most excludable good that we have. And during the early 20th century, those corporations you're referring to, like Texaco and the predecessor of Exxon, like Standard Oil and so forth, went around the world. I mean, especially in the Middle East, Venezuela, Nigeria, they had a major prerogative, and that was to establish rights, to establish property rights to minerals, we call them mineral rights. So those minerals were typically held in common, right? And so held in common maybe by a king or by a government or something. There really wasn't a lot of individual property rights like exist in the United States. So property was, the mineral rights were established for the sole reason for extracting that property, in the United States, where individual property rights are the norm, we still have lots of common land. What would we call it in the United States? What would that commonly held land be called?
It'd be like parks and whatnot, like public lands.
Public lands, yeah, or federal lands, right? I mean, there are some state lands, but most of the public lands of the United States are administered by the Bureau of Land Management. Okay. Now, if those are commonly held lands, does that mean that you cannot extract petroleum and natural gas from them? No. All right. It doesn't. But if somebody can't easily go in and drill a well in Nevada, which like more than 80% of the state is public land, you won't be able to just go in and take out petroleum and natural gas, because there is a government in place that regulates the production of anything, petroleum, I say the extraction of anything, petroleum, gas, coal, whatever, from public lands. And that's the Bureau of Land Management most of the time. So there is a government administration in place, or a government agency in place to regulate that. But if we were in a different country where the government was non-functional, then yeah, it would probably be possible to extract that good in a non-excludable good sense. Okay, in other words, the Wild West would be a possibility. But wherever you have the establishment of property rights, and especially land rights, you're probably going to have you're probably going to have an excludable good. Now, take the fishing example might be helpful to find another example that we can go for. What would be another example? Maybe from history. I don't know.
Market hunting.
Market hunting, yeah. In fact, they talked about bison.
Right.
The bison kill-off was actually subsidized by the federal government. Really? They put. I believe they kept the price of fertilizer. There was a demand for fertilizer and a demand for hides and so on. But there were political reasons why the bison were killed off. You all know that, right? So the market hunting, like back in the early part of the 20th century, market hunting for feathers, for women's hats and stuff. That was one problem. Now, the issue here is that the resource is mobile, right? It's really difficult to establish property rights to a resource that can move around. All right, you got that? So oil and gas, pretty much in place, or at least the location. And by the way, just to go back to that oil and gas example, when a well is drilled in the United States, when a well is drilled, and maybe directional drilling is being used, or hydraulic fracturing, which basically is pulling petroleum from a very broad area far away from the wellhead. And I'm talking about in a great wide radius from the wellhead. There are laws that require mineral owners away from the well being drilled and outside of it, the right square the well is being drilled. Those people are going to be getting proportional royalties for the petroleum being taken out. So it's not like they're stealing property that they don't own because of directional drilling. In other words, there are ways that people are compensated for the property that that is being extracted from beneath them. Right.
All right, I see that. I see what you're saying.
So anyway, so these mobile, they're sort of they're what we might call the stationary resources: coal, timber. All right, but then there are these non-stationary resources that move around, like wildlife. Can you think of another one? A resource that you can use that has a tendency to relocate.
Water?
Water, yeah, exactly. How about another one? Maybe air?
Still doing common for common?
Pardon?
For the common goods?
Yeah, I mean it's non-excludable, right? So water is a great example, especially in the West. How would you go about creating property rights for water if water is moving? And usually what we're talking about is water out of a stream or river, right? Or out of a drainage basin. how would you establish property rights to the water? Is it possible? Well, anyway, in fact, when the Spanish came into into North America, they brought a particular type of property rights that we usually refer to today as, in the Western states mostly, what is it? The right of, what is it? Not riparian rights. That's the other one. Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain cramp at the moment. So first, what is it called? I'm gonna have to cut that one out. Sorry. We'll come back to it when we get to water resources. But anyway, the British, in the eastern part of the United States, we didn't consider water to be much of a resource because it was never so scarce, right? So the British were not very good at regulating water like the Spanish were. Prior appropriation, it came to me finally. Okay, sorry. The Spanish system of allocating water rights is called the doctrine of prior appropriation, or just appropriative water rights. And the way that works is whoever gets to use the water, in a situation of a drought or something, water is allocated, or the rights to water along a stream are allocated based on the timing of settlement. So if someone has a ranch and it was established in, let's say, 1842, another person and the property rights were established in 1842. The property rights can be passed down, like land property, like ownership to land. And another ranch that's maybe established in 1912, okay? Well, the ranch established in 1912 is the owner of that property right, or that water right, is not going to be able to exclude the other person who has the older right. Is not going to be able to is not going to be able to hold water that person may need. All right, that's hard to imagine. But if you're downstream and you have a prior appropriation, okay, to that stream, someone upstream who is a more recent arrival cannot deny you the water that you need. All right, and that's a bizarre system, but it works, and it's gone on for quite a long time in the Western United States. So again, property rights, good fences, clear boundaries are sort of the natural way of allowing people to maintain, to not overuse and not completely obliterate a natural resource. Because we assume that people have their own best interests at heart, right? Those fishermen in New Zealand that have those individual, or those, what were those referred to as? Individual transferable quotas?
Yeah, ITQ.
ITQs, okay. How do they get those?
They're just given to them, right?
Don't you have to buy into it? So, I mean, you have the right to catch so much, but no more. So you've purchased that, and that's, you've basically created the property right, or you have an incentive to make sure that those individual quotas are not cheated upon, okay, by other people. Anyway, so the idea here is that we want to, when we're dealing with non-excludable resources, we want to create a system, even if it's in an abstract way, to encourage people to behave as if they owned part of that resource, because we assume that ownership in itself is going to probably lead to a more equitable or a more sustainable use. It's bizarre. I mean, it's not an easy concept. Now, when we get farther into the course, you'll notice that there are certain government agencies that tend to work mostly with public lands in the United States, and we'll focus on the United States as most of our examples. But there are also agencies, one in particular, that have worked specifically with private landowners, private property owners, in order to encourage conservation. And so that's, and that particular agency has been pretty successful in its efforts to bring about conservation-oriented behavior. All right. So, you know, our behavior in itself, our individual behavior, is something that can be maybe, you know, conservation-minded or not conservation-minded. What do you all think about? I mean, what's human nature like? Is it, you know, why are some people more conservation conscious than others? I mean, that's
Education, just knowing more about what conservation means.
and let's not limit ourselves to natural resources for this conversation.
Is this how you want to transfer to talking about peak oil? I think that.
Well, I'm not going to talk about peak oil today. I decided, yeah. But we will get to that when we get to minerals, okay? Because that's a pretty complicated idea. But just in your own individual behavior, are you sometimes, I'll ask you, are you sometimes more conservation minded and sometimes less conservation minded?
It has to do with money, right? Because like if you're running low on money, you're going to be more like,
Yeah.
I mean, because it's about like how much capital you have that you can put towards, like, because if you're more conservation minded, you probably don't have as much money because, you know, you got to make stuff stretch out longer. But if you are less, you know.
Let me give you an example. I'll be right back. Okay, here we are. I got an example from my own bathroom. All right. How many of you? I'm sure all of you. Have you ever been in this situation? You know, and maybe you've got a date and you got to brush your teeth. You should brush your teeth twice a day at least, right? But you open the cap and, man, I have been working on this tube for several days now, and there's not much left in it, okay? What's that going to do to your conservation-minded behavior? I mean, are you going to be more of a conservationist as you see that tube getting smaller and smaller?
Yeah.
Would you have the same? I mean, I can brush my teeth with just a tiny smidgen of toothpaste. It's okay, right? Do you act like that? I mean, not that we need to conserve toothpaste, but I'm saying that, you know, we have this mindset that we're going to make this stretch out. I'm going to make this tube of toothpaste work for a long time if this is all I have. But if I have this in the drawer, I may not. I'll just throw this away. I can, I'm not going to worry about it too much. And if I look a little farther in the drawer and well, I've got this. Okay, I've got 3 more tubes in the waiting. I'm not going to worry too much about it. You know what I'm talking about? Is that situation of necessity often makes us act a little bit more conservation-y, okay, if that's a word. How can we encourage people to, and should we even encourage people to act in a conservation, with a conservation mindset like that? My initial reaction is, yeah, of course. If you can make things go farther, why not? But is there any argument against it? Well, the toothpaste factory won't want you to do that. They want you to use as much toothpaste as you can, right? Because they're going to be profiting from that. Colgate or whatever it is. Maybe that's just a weird example, but can you think of anything else that's sort of like that? I mean, obviously, yeah.
Beginning of COVID, there was a lot of issues with toilet paper supply. There's grocery stores everywhere. You'd only get 2 rolls a day or something like that.
Yeah.
2 packages a day.
What'd you say? I'm sorry, I was talking.
Well, with the toilet paper, grocery stores and supermarkets, they'll only let you get 2 packages a day or every visit.
Right.
And that was their way of mitigating the distribution of toilet paper.
Yeah, they were going to sell it all. So they tried their best to, make people happy, to keep people coming through the doors. If there's no toilet paper at this Walmart, then the word's going to get around, right?
We just bought a bidet, so that worked itself out.
All right. Well, okay. So there are runs on the market, right, for certain things. All right. Well, maybe we're exhausting this point a little bit, and maybe